From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Trump stares down the judge in his civil fraud trial during closing arguments. Following a town hall from him and his Republican opponents going head-to-head in a debate last night, we'll examine where things stand with the Iowa caucuses just 4 days away.
The government shutdown could begin in just days as Speaker Mike Johnson appears to waffle on the bipartisan top-line spending levels already agreed to. We'll talk this out with Democratic Representative Abigail Spanberger of Virginia.
And U.S. inflation picked up in December. We'll have more on the economic outlook and what it means for U.S. businesses with Suzanne Clark from the Chamber of Commerce.
Well, Kaylee, here we go. After a night of split-screen viewing, the two candidates, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, having their final debate, but it was the man across town at a very different event that may well have stolen the night.
Counter-programming once again as a solo individual in this town hall, really running more of a general election kind of argument than his opponents who are competing for second place and were just throwing a lot of darts at each other. But interesting to see his clarification on one point in particular.
Yeah, it was kind of an effort to normalize some things by Donald Trump last evening, and in this case, clarifying remarks about being a dictator during the town hall on Fox. Here he is.
I said, I'm going to be a dictator. For one day, we're going to do two things. The border, we're going to make it so tight you can't get in unless you come in legally. And the other is energy. We're going to drill, baby, drill. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator.
Joining us now with more are Bloomberg's Laura Davison and Gregory Cordy. So, Gregory, he just underscored it. Still just for one day. After that, no dictator to be found. His name is Donald Trump. Did he win last night?
Look, it's always tough to tell how much these things resonate in real time, although I've talked to a number of Republican strategists in Iowa who said people are probably more focused on that Haley-DeSantis debate. There was a little bit more drama there. They know about Donald Trump. They don't know as much about DeSantis and Haley. And by the way, Iowa's snowed in right now, so really all anybody has to do is sit around and watch these things. Iowa voters are very engaged. They're late deciders, and they're starting to pay attention here. But, you know, we're going to hear this from Donald Trump throughout the year, right, where he tiptoes up to the line, he crosses the line, then he pulls it back. And so today he's not a dictator. We'll see what he says tomorrow and maybe into next week.
Well, he was on Fox. CNN was the venue for Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. Laura, I heard the word liar more times, I think, than I can probably count for one evening. It was 2 hours. They beat each other up for the first, then they started to criticize Donald Trump for the second. Will any of it matter, though, with so little time?
It's looking like right now they are in a solid race for second place. Neither of them really able to overtake the lead that Trump has. Right now, the name of the game for both of them is to just beat expectations. Ron DeSantis has the most at stake right now. He has basically bet the farm on Iowa. He has all his campaign there, all his money there. And when you look at the later states, you go on to New Hampshire and South Carolina, he doesn't have an operation there. He's not polling particularly well. So he has to prove both to voters in Iowa as well as, you know, in the voters that are going to be coming down the line that he can have some momentum and potentially come in close second. Nikki Haley, she just needs to do well enough because she's going into more friendly territory going forward.
Well, let's hear from Nikki Haley herself, because, of course, it wasn't just last night that she was speaking. She's still actively campaigning in the final days to Iowa. And here's some of what she had to say today.
We have a country to save. But in order to do that, we've got to acknowledge some hard truths. Republicans have lost the last 7 out of 8 popular votes for president. That's nothing to be proud of. We should want to win the majority of Americans. But the only way we're going to do that is if we elect a new generational leader that leaves the negativity and the baggage behind and focuses on the future and the solutions going forward.
And Gregory, this idea of leaving the past in the past is also something you're hearing from Ron DeSantis, that this election shouldn't be about January 6, 2021. It should be about November 2024. It seems, though, that that's really kind of the extent of where they're willing to go when it comes to go after the former president.
Yeah, we saw this last night in that debate where they spent most of their time going after each other and very little talking about the guy who's 30 points ahead of either one of them. This is the delicate dance that all of these candidates who are not Trump have to do, not to alienate Trump's key base of supporters who they're going to need however they get to a shooting range of Trump. It's a very delicate dance. And so the best way they've figured out to talk about Trump is to talk about the chaos of the past, moving to the future. That's about as much as they'll criticize the former president.
This is, of course, coming the same day that Chris Christie dropped out of the race. We were looking at images of him making that announcement around this time yesterday. So there are questions about how much momentum Nikki Haley might be able to get from those New Hampshire voters. But when we look at Iowa, it's a different dynamic, of course, Laura. And I was struck to hear him last evening, to hear Nikki Haley, I should say, last evening, say that Donald Trump lost the election and Joe Biden won it. Will that keep her from peeling off Trump voters?
That's certainly going to be an issue that she's going to have to contend with. Does she want to go further? She said on the campaign trail, she's been asked, hey, by voters, we want you to criticize Trump more. And she says, look, I'm just not going to go there. And that is almost surely a line that has been workshopped of how do you, bring people along, but also not alienate some people you're going to need. With Chris Christie, for example, dropping out, his timing, it should be very helpful to her. In Iowa, he hasn't really campaigned. That's not going to be a huge game changer on Monday night, but looking forward, 10 days from now, in New Hampshire, where he has, significant support, significant being 10%. So adjust your expectations.
Yeah.
Well, and as we talk about the acknowledgement that Joe Biden won the 2020 election, that's not just something that candidates have struggled to answer, but perhaps members of Congress as well, as there are many members of Congress who did not certify those results, still struggle with that question today. And the Speaker of the House, you might be able to include in that group, but he's faced some challenges of his own. Laura, do we or do we not have a top-line deal intact as we face down the risk of a government shutdown if we don't sort out appropriations in the next several days?
As of right now, it's very unclear if there's a deal. Speaker Mike Johnson is going to have to decide whether he's going to hold that deal that his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy, made with Democrats, or if he's going to break that and basically do what his conservative right flank wants to do. This is going to be kind of the first big test for him to see if he can, try to manage this delicate dance. Of course, he could go the way of Kevin McCarthy. It just takes one person to oust him. Republicans don't really want to do that again, but basically no one's happy, and Congress isn't necessarily rational when it comes to some of these things.
Okay, so if you're following along on your home game, the government will start shutting down a week from tomorrow if this is not handled in that amount of time. And so it's become a question of whether the Speaker of the House will in fact endorse the idea of a stopgap solution. But Gregory, that would be right in the middle of Iowa and New Hampshire voting. How can that all happen at the same time with the noise coming from the early states? And we know the Speaker's in touch with Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. And you look, this is the problem with the House Republican Party, where they have just the narrowest of governing majorities and unable to lose even a handful of votes without then having to resort to getting Democratic votes for anything. As soon as they do that, then, as Laura pointed out, you can have just one member of the Republican conference come to the floor and move to vacate the chair. So this is the tenuous position that Kevin McCarthy found himself in. Now Mike Johnson, and who knows, maybe a third speaker if things do not go well here.
All right, our thanks to Bloomberg's Laura Davis and Gregory Cordy. Great conversation to get things rolling this evening. And coming up, Democratic Congresswoman from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, will continue the conversation with us live from Capitol Hill. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
We're having thoughtful conversations about funding options and priorities. We had a cross-section of members in today. We'll continue having cross-sections of members in. And while those conversations are going on, I've made no commitment. So if you hear otherwise, it's just simply not true.
Are you open to...
We're looking forward to those conversations.
We have an agreement. Republicans need to keep their word and stop playing or any games here. We cannot have a shutdown. The American people do not deserve a shutdown. And that is their basic duty, to keep the government open. We've been pretty consistent about this.
The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre today on opposite sides of the coin here on government funding and a debate that has yet to resolve. Let's go down to Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia with us now live from Capitol Hill. Representative, it's great to see you. This is like a recurring nightmare. I probably don't need to tell you that. And I'm just wondering, when you consider the options facing the Speaker of the House here, are we going to start shutting down next week, or will he have to entertain a continuing resolution to keep things open? What do you see coming?
This is a continuing nightmare for my constituents. You are right. Just in case people have wanted to forget, in the spring, we were barreling towards a potential government shutdown because then Speaker McCarthy would or wouldn't contend with the issue of the debt ceiling. Then we saw that we were going to get past the end of September without our appropriations bills done, signed into law. We needed a continuing resolution. Will he, won't he? Then again, as we reached a new speaker, had a new speaker elected, will they, won't they shut down the government? Every single time this happens, the tens of thousands of federal employees I represent, as well as contractors and small business owners and nonprofit leaders across Virginia, are trying to make decisions about how they are going to continue their operations. It is absolutely inexcusable that the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader came to a deal to move forward with appropriations, and now we are hearing that the Speaker may or may not move forward with that. The bottom line is we cannot have a partial shutdown, we cannot have a full shutdown, and if this appropriation bill is not done, or funding bill is not done in time, then we need to have a continuing resolution and then finish the funding as soon as possible, because FY25 funding appropriations timeframe is almost upon us.
Yeah. Well, Congresswoman, I'm sure you're just as aware as we are of the difficult position Speaker Johnson is in, knowing what happened to his predecessor, who essentially had to make a binary choice between keeping the government open and keeping the Speaker's gavel. Would it not make this whole thing easier if Democrats said, look, we will do for you what we did not do for Kevin McCarthy, and if it comes down to it, we will protect you if it means funding this government?
Let me be very clear. Kevin McCarthy made that choice. He didn't have to do anything. He made a deal with the far-right flank to become Speaker in the first place. If he had begun his time as Speaker of the House with a commitment to governing and not bringing us to this point of perilous, is it going to be a nightmare or won't, will it or won't it be, then he wouldn't have created a circumstance that would have put him in that position. Speaker Johnson has the opportunity to demonstrate that he wants to do the job of Speaker of the House, that he wants to govern. He doesn't have to force the entirety of the Republican conference to vote for the bill. He only needs to bring it forward. There are plenty of Democrats who will ensure that we do the basic, bare-bones job of actually keeping the government funding, paying our border security agents, our border patrol, paying our service members in harm's way, paying our FBI agents who are keeping us safe from threats of terror, paying the TSA agents at the airports, the air traffic controllers, keeping our planes safe, particularly as we continue to have severe weather events. This is the brass tacks of governing, and the Speaker should do his job, bring the bill. Democrats will surely bring votes. And those who don't want to vote for it don't have to, but he needs to do the responsible thing and just bring the bill for a vote.
There's a lot we're not talking about now because of all of this. We haven't even mentioned border, which is all we were obsessed with ahead of the holidays, the potential for a generational deal on border that would unlock funding for Ukraine and Israel. In the meantime, there are great concerns about what's happening in Israel, expanding into a wider conflict, Congresswoman, from your perch on the Foreign Affairs Committee and with your experience in the CIA. I wonder what you think the next move should be, particularly with what's happening in the Red Sea. Should the U.S. retaliate against Houthi rebels in Yemen who have been attacking shipping now on a daily basis?
As a former intelligence officer and now a member of the Intel Committee, it is very clear that the United States needs to continue to aggressively demonstrate a posture of deterrence, more aggressively than we have shown.
Should we hit them at the source, though,
late.
Congresswoman?
What I think what you're getting at is these are Iranian-backed proxies that are continuing to attack U.S. servicemen and U.S. infrastructure and interests. And we have to demonstrate that that is absolutely unacceptable and that we will take action to defend our own service members and certainly the commercial routes that they have been impeding.
But at this point, Congresswoman, is the only effective deterrence offense? Because the defensive deterrence at this point does not seem to be stopping any of this activity.
Certainly, there are a variety of options before the Department of Defense and the Department of State, and I think any and all of them should be on the table in terms of how it is that we make clear to both Iran and the proxies that are doing their bidding that the increase in aggressive behavior towards U.S. interests and U.S. service members is absolutely unacceptable and will not be tolerated.
Well, as this is all happening, we have a Secretary of Defense who is recovering from an extended stay in the hospital. In fact, I believe he is still in the hospital doing his duties from there, with a lot of questions, Congresswoman, about where he went for a couple of days, why he was not in contact with other officials at the Pentagon or at the White House. The Armed Services Committee in your House of Representatives is launching a formal inquiry, and today we learned that the Pentagon's Inspector General is launching a probe. Considering your experience serving the country and the number of active duty and retired military in your district in Virginia, how concerned should we be here about what's going on? And does the Secretary of Defense owe the President and the American people a better explanation?
I think we've seen the Secretary of Defense has owned his mistake, that he absolutely should have very clearly defined for the White House the reason he was undergoing surgery, and then ultimately when, as we now know, there were complications from that surgery, the reality of his hospitalization. He has owned that mistake. It was absolutely wrong of him to keep that information from the White House. And I think that, now we are in the process of, frankly, moving on from here. It should be the administration's policy to have very clear next steps, that in the circumstance that any secretary may be undergoing anesthesia, may be hospitalized or otherwise incapacitated, that there are very clear parameters on what steps are taken to both inform the White House and ensure chain of command, particularly as it relates to the Department of Defense, but certainly across all of our cabinet secretary positions. Those contingencies are important to have in place.
Well, we're hearing increased calls for his resignation, Congresswoman. Should he resign?
No. Absolutely not. He is an incredibly experienced, steady hand with strong military experience. As long as he is healthy enough and able to continue doing the job, his decades worth of experience is extraordinarily important and vital to U.S. national security.
Well, finally, Congresswoman, you may not be resigning from your current job, but you are seeking another one as you run for governor of Virginia. Is that a statement on the state of Virginia, or is that a statement on the House of Representatives and the ability to get work done there?
Certainly, I have loved my time in the House of Representatives, and despite some of the chaos that we continue to see, I have been extraordinarily successful in getting bills to the president's desk, be it the former president or the current president. But my decision to announce my retirement from Congress and to run for governor in Virginia is based predominantly on my love for the great Commonwealth and my desire to continue my service localized in our Commonwealth.
All right, Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Now, coming up, we'll turn to the economy as December inflation data comes in above estimates. A little hot. We'll get more on that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
I think March is probably too early in my estimation for a rate decline, because I think we need to see some more evidence. I think the December CPI report just shows there's more work to do, and that work is going to take restrictive monetary policy.
That was Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester speaking earlier today with Bloomberg's Mike McKee on the heels of a hotter than expected inflation print for the month of December. Joining us now with more analysis is Stuart Paul of Bloomberg Economics. So, Stuart, does the slightly hot CPI take March completely off the table?
I don't think that it takes March completely out of the picture. There are still cracks in the labor market that have been widening. But today's relatively hot CPI report definitely does reduce the odds of a March rate cut. Of course, about half of the 30 basis points of headline CPI growth during the month was driven by shelter, relatively predictable. The bulk of the rest came from other core services. But what's a little bit out of the ordinary is that after 6 months of outright deflation in core goods categories, there was neither drag nor a contribution coming from core goods, but some of the most interest-sensitive spending categories are in core goods, like auto prices, which surprised to the upside during the month. So the Fed might be inclined to keep its foot on the brakes a little bit longer, unless we were to, of course, see a jobs report with the bottom truly falling out.
I spoke earlier, Stuart, with the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, Jared Bernstein, to get the view of the administration, and they're certainly trying to put a good spin on any economic data that is released. He made the point in this case that it doesn't move in a straight line, and that, no month makes a trend. And you could imagine those talking points coming. What he seemed far more concerned about was a government shutdown, and we do have a great possibility that one could begin next week. Here's what Bernstein told us about it earlier on Bloomberg Sound On.
Low unemployment, inflation easing, real wage gains, actual cost reductions in key areas of consumer spending. The idea that we would want to kick the ball in our own goal with an unnecessary government shutdown when I think majorities on both sides want to avoid that is absolutely counterindicated right now.
So if we kick the ball in our own goal, here, Stuart, to stick with a theme here, what would be the cost at the end of the game?
So for each week that a government shutdown goes on, there's typically about a 0.25 percentage point of GDP growth that's shaved off. So, for example, we're currently estimating the GDP growth is going to be about 1.9%, just a touch under 2% during Q1. If we were to have a government shutdown that lasted 4 weeks, for example, we end up seeing Q1 GDP growth of just 1% in that case. Now, government reopens, workers who are furloughed come back, and you end up seeing a bit of a rebound in the subsequent quarter. That could be good for an incumbent as we're in an election year. On the unemployment side, with about 800,000 workers that would end up being furloughed, we would expect to see at least a temporary uptick in the pace of in the rate of unemployment by about 40 basis points. So going from about 3.7 to about 4.1% in the event of a government shutdown. Again, that's something that would be temporary, and if we were to end up seeing growth that ends up getting pushed into Q2, that could be good for an incumbent in the election year.
Well, it's great information to have as we consider this possibility. Our thanks to Stuart Paul of Bloomberg Economics. Great to have you back, Stuart. Coming up, U.S. Chamber of Commerce CEO will join us to discuss the state of the business community and the consumer. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
We need to stand up for the people and not bow down to woke corporations.
We don't need government fighting against our private industries. Government doesn't bully our businesses, and that can't happen.
Republican presidential candidates Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley sparring on business in their debate on CNN last night. And speaking of business, the Chamber of Commerce has released its 2024 State of American Business Report, showing improvements in consumer trends and supply chains, but concerns with innovation and IPO markets. Let's discuss with U.S. Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Suzanne Clark, who is joining us now. Suzanne, what about concerns around the presidential election, considering the candidates we're dealing with here?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. You know, one of my favorite lines in the speech was about how American businesses don't have the luxury of worry of sitting back and admiring problems, but instead have to get to work. So what we're really thinking about this election year is how, number one, there's so many negative campaign ads, and how do we rise above it and remind people that America's best years can be in front of us? And number two, how do we pressure candidates, policymakers at every level on both sides of the aisle to remember what a superpower American business is, how important it is for families and workers, and frankly, our national security. So watch for us to get even louder this year.
Well, you're making the case, arguably louder, for free enterprise. And I wonder if you think American business, if private enterprise, has a messaging problem.
I think the issue is, as a country, we've stopped talking about pro-business and being pro-growth. And we want to encourage the 134 million private sector workers, the 5.4 million, did you see the number today? This record high 5.4 million entrepreneurs who filed new business applications. We want to encourage these people to talk about why they're optimistic, because the reason they're optimistic is this is the most resilient, dynamic system in the world. And we need to start respecting and supporting this free enterprise system and frankly, defending against some of the attacks on it.
Well, you talk about the resilience, maybe not just of the system, but also I think the resilience of the U.S. economy has surprised many, even though inflation has come down, growth has hung in there, the labor market has as well. As the message you are receiving from your members at the chamber that they expect that to continue, that the landing will be soft, no recession, and business is looking good?
Look, I think last year we coined the term secondhand pessimism because we kept hearing from companies that they felt good about their business, but were worried about the overall economy. We still hear some of that. I would say that if you're in politics, you talk about politics. If you're in business, you talk about business. And what business people talk about are inputs. How expensive is labor? When there are 100 job openings for every 71 workers, how tough is that? How much pressure is that to find the right talent? And so I think people want to be optimistic. That's why they're hiring. That's why they're creating new products and services. But they'd like to see government help set some conditions that can help us be successful.
I'm glad you mentioned workers. Let's go a little bit further down that road, Suzanne. One of the lines in your speech that jumped out to me was your defining of what businesses do. You said they harness human talent and potential and make it exponentially more productive. We're watching wages rise faster than inflation. And we're seeing in some pockets of the country, certainly as we saw in Hollywood and in Detroit, union contracts that are boosting wages not only for members, but in some cases, non-members. Even Tesla is announcing a big raise today. Does this trend, if it continues, make workers less productive?
I think this trend, if it continues, makes small business really scared, right? If you look at the inflation numbers from today, I think they're a blip. I think your previous guest was right. I think we can get back to inflation decreasing, the Fed decreasing rates. I think we can get to that place. But when I talk to small businesses, what they say is it's hard to keep up with these wage increases. When you talk to families, they'll say it's hard to keep up with these prices. So we hear a little bit more about fear of, in this tight labor market, at some point, the supply and demand problem is really the problem, as we all learned in Econ 101, right? At some point, we've got to increase supply, and that's going to mean increasing legal immigration.
Well, when we think about things that could ease the way for businesses on the worker front, sure, immigration policy may play a role, but there's other policy as well, including tax policy, especially as our understanding is there is talks of a deal being made on Capitol Hill right now related to business tax and the child tax credit as well. This is something we addressed earlier today on Bloomberg with Heather Boucher, a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. This is what she told us.
Well, let's be very clear. This is all just negotiations, and the president has remained committed to the fact that if we're going to do anything that gives businesses tax credits, that we make sure that people and families also get the tax relief that they need.
What would a tax deal like this mean for members of the chamber?
Well, I think we'd have to see the details, right? It's hard to talk about it in this speculative way. And with what's going on the Hill right now, it's a little bit hard to be optimistic. But I think to the point that taxes are low and businesses are able to invest in their business, in their communities, and in their workers, that's proven over time to be better for families, better for communities, better for the country. So we like some of the details of what we're seeing. We have been working on these extenders for a long time. We'd like to see it come to pass, but really we'd like to see everything that they're talking about right now, fixing the mess at the border, the crisis at the border, dealing with Ukraine and Israel's supplemental, dealing with these tax extenders. It's why we need a government that works.
Okay, well, I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago. As this debate over border security becomes something apparently real here in Washington, we've been waiting decades for this to happen. Are you disappointed that Republican members on the Hill are only having a conversation about security and not legal immigration that the job market so desperately needs?
Look, I think it's a great question, but I'll go back to, I don't feel like the business community has time for feelings. And so it's not that we're disappointed or angry or hopeful or happy. It's that we want to get to work. And so to your excellent point, we do need more legal immigration in this country. There are way too many jobs for way too few of workers, right? It is also true that this is a crisis, both in terms of national security and humanitarian issues and people at the border. And so we need to have, it's a complex problem, right? We need actual physical barriers. We need, an asylum hearing takes 7 years? That's nuts, right? So there are process, there's resources, there are agents, there are physical barriers, and there's legal immigration. And we need smart people to do complex work and stop politicking on it.
All right, Suzanne Clark, U.S. Chamber of Commerce President and CEO, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we have some breaking news this evening to deal with as well. The UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has authorized joint military strikes against the Houthis in coordination, we understand, with the U.S. This is according to a person familiar with the matter who spoke with Bloomberg. The U.S. and the UK jointly, it appears, striking or authorizing a strike against Houthi rebels in Yemen. The Cabinet in the UK approved this decision on a conference call earlier today, with airstrikes possible as soon as later in the evening. Again, this is according to people familiar with the matter, that Sunak has authorized joint military strikes with the U.S. against the Houthis. So we'll have more on that throughout the evening on Bloomberg Television. But coming up here, Trump attending the last day of his civil fraud trial just 4 days before the Iowa Republican caucuses. We'll be joined by our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
We've proven this case so conclusively. We've asked for directed verdict many times. They don't have any facts. They don't have any evidence against us. Millions and millions of pages, years of litigation, and all politically motivated.
The former president, Donald Trump, bit earlier today after closing arguments in his civil fraud trial in New York. Let's assemble our political panel. Maura Gillespie is back from Blue Stack Strategies alongside Caitlin Legacki, partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. Great to have both of you with us. When we consider the Republican side of the aisle here, a day after the final debate before Iowa, a debate which Donald Trump skipped. Typically the next day the candidates would be out there leading the news, talking about what happened last night. But today it was Donald Trump, again, back in court. Is he doing everything right?
If you're Donald Trump's campaign,
yeah.
Yes. He's taking out all the oxygen. He's focused on why he's running for office in the first place. It's for himself. And this is just him getting to have the narrative and controlling the narrative, playing the victim. And it's really what he's been running on since he announced he was going to run again. And so if you're Donald Trump's campaign team, you're feeling pretty good about things right now. And that, I do think, should be scary to the rest of the GOP as they look at this as he's running for himself. He's only talking about things that impact him individually. Nothing that talks about what he would do as president other than pardon people and get himself out of jail. That's concerning across the board for a lot of reasons, but especially for a party and the Republican Party that this election is ours to lose as the GOP. And with Donald Trump, that's going to happen.
But if you listen to his language, Caitlin, on his town hall last night, it seemed like he was at least trying to dial back some things. He reiterated he only wants to be a dictator for a day, but he said after that, I won't be a dictator. He also talked about how it wasn't retribution he was seeking, even though maybe campaign emails you receive may indicate otherwise. Is his tempering of the messaging working?
No. And, I mean, frankly, like what you're going to know and see out of last night's town hall is the fact that he took credit for overturning Roe versus Wade. You're going to see that clip played on loop for the next 6 months, and you're going to be sick of it. But I think that town hall last night for him was not helpful. And, to the extent that it blots out the sun for the other candidates, yes, that helps him. But as soon as we switch to a general election, his tenor, his tone is more of the same chaos we saw while he was in the White House. And it's what people have repeatedly voted against.
A couple of things were said out loud last night. Nikki Haley said Donald Trump lost the election.
Yep.
To Caitlin's point, Donald Trump said, the quote, For 54 years, conservatives were trying to get Roe v. Wade terminated, and I did it, and I'm proud to have done it. More of that is grist for the mill for Democrats, isn't it?
It's also interesting. It is, but it's also interesting because then he went back and started saying a kind of word salad of things about abortion. He really struggled to answer that question. And I thought that was interesting because he is, maybe part of his brain was thinking, okay, for a general, I can't, be so strict, but also Iowa's on Monday. So you can see in his brain, he's like, I don't know how to say this. But it is a real problem. And the Republicans, and Nikki Haley has hit on this time and time again, the abortion issue is a losing issue for Republicans when they speak about it in such strict terms. We are not, as a party, going to win elections with the 6-week ban, the any restrictions that a lot of politicians have been playing to, and especially Ron DeSantis is playing to the crowd in Iowa. So it's going to be fodder for Democrats to hit on Republicans across the 2024 down ballot.
Well, and as Caitlin says, probably expect to hear that very soundbite in campaign ads for a long time. Speaking of things that are appearing in campaign ads, Nikki Haley's suggestion that the retirement age was too low, something she had said on this network, and you may actually recognize one of the individuals in that ad, is now something that Trump's campaign is putting out. Trump seems to be going after Nikki Haley to a much larger degree. Caitlin, does that signal anything about whether or not he is feeling more vulnerable than maybe he was just a few weeks ago?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the Republican primary electorate, they tend to be older, they tend to be whiter. My parents live down in South Carolina. They have all of their old retired friends that live in their neighborhood, and they all pay attention to this issue very closely. Same with New Hampshire, where Nikki Haley, his polling indicates she's within single digits. And so it's clear that he is trying to bat her down. But the reality is also that Donald Trump has taken the exact same position on Social Security. And this might buy him a little wiggle room for a couple weeks, but he's in the exact same boat that she is.
Wow. Meanwhile, the president won't touch this one, right? Does this become a general election theme, a general election topic, or does it die out as soon as the primaries are done?
I'm sure we'll bring it up. Again, if it is Trump and Biden, it will
We heard it twice last night, by the way, in the debate and the town hall.
But it's not the number one concern of voters. The economy and safety and security are 1 and 2. Abortion is going to play more of a role, I believe, than Social Security will play. And so that pushes that topic down on the list of things that are really going to either drive people to the polls and to which candidate they're going to vote for. So I don't see it playing a huge role, but it's, to Caitlin's point.
How should she have answered that when I asked her that question?
I mean, I think she answered it the way that she has planned to, right? Like, she has said 70 is the number, and you got to give credit to Nikki Haley. She's not afraid to say that she's going to stand by that. It's time to move on. It's time to change things. It's time to adjust to what the current lifespan of our society is.
All right, well, hold your thoughts because we're already talking about Nikki Haley, but we got to do it some more, and Ron DeSantis as well. So coming up with our political panel, we'll have more on their debate, their battle last night. In the final time we will see them share the stage before the Iowa caucus. Our political panel is sticking with us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
It's time we have an accountant in the White House. We have to have someone that respects taxpayer dollars.
We don't need an accountant in the White House. We need a leader in the White House. And that's what I would bring.
If he can't handle the financial parts of a campaign, how's he going to handle the economy when it comes to the White House?
The American dream is slipping away. People are working hard. They're getting the most out of their God-given ability. They're doing everything right, and they're falling further and further behind.
We need to start cutting spending in D.C. We have to go back to pre-COVID levels. That's why I'll veto any spending bill that doesn't take us back to pre-COVID levels.
Here's the thing. We need to fly a flag of bold colors, carrying the banner of putting the American people first, not the pale pastels of the warmed-over corporatism of people like Nikki Haley.
Ron DeSantis going head-to-head against Nikki Haley one final time before the Iowa caucuses. So who came out on top, if anyone? Let's bring back our political panel, Maura Gillespie of Blue Stack Strategies and Caitlin Legacki, partner at Four Corners Public Affairs. So, Caitlin, we have 4 days left until caucus goers, go to the caucuses. You have limited time here to change any minds. Did either of them change minds with that performance last night?
No, I think if anything, they probably solidified support among their existing supporters. But I have a hard time believing that either of them influenced any undecided voters last night, especially in the context that Donald Trump was having counter-programming on Fox News at the same time, where the vast majority of your caucus goers are going to be paying attention.
During the debate last evening, Ron DeSantis criticized Nikki Haley's inability, I guess, as he put it, to take scrutiny. Let's listen to what he said.
I think part of the problem with her candidacy is now that she's getting scrutiny, she's got this problem with ballistic podiatry, shooting herself in the foot every other day, saying things that now she doesn't even take questions from people.
Look, first of all, Maura, he's been accused of or criticized for not being able to take criticism for the balance of this campaign. But to go to the podiatry, to go to the shoes,
Ballistic
the man,
podiatry.
ballistic no less, who's been accused of wearing inserts, the high heels inside the cowboy boots that Donald Trump talked about last night on Fox. What was up with that rehearsed line? Is he getting bad advice?
Across the board, this was a failure for both of them, though, because they're just fighting each other. For the first hour and a half, maybe, they were just bickering and mudslinging at each other, as opposed to the person who was counter-programming on the network that they needed to really be on, and Donald Trump, and they're not hitting on him enough at all. And so it does make it just kind of child's play at this point, and you're seeing these lame attacks on one or the other. But it's not helpful, and honestly, it's for our party talking about the issues. Nikki Haley wanting to talk about the economy, talking about our debt. In 10 years, we have added to the debt. I mean, doubled it in 10 years. That's insane. So she's right to bring that up. What they're not talking about, unfortunately, is how to do it. And Donald Trump is also not talking about how to do it. And voters should want to know that.
I don't feel like ballistic podiatry is going to get on a bumper sticker.
I also don't think it's going to help us with our debt. So
Okay.
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know about you guys. I had to stop and think about it for a second. I was like, okay, you put this together, ballistic and podiatry. Oh, I get what he's
I would
trying
love to know who came up with that. Whose idea was like, hey, this is going to be a real zinger to throw in the debate tomorrow night.
Well, you could tell he was waiting for his moment to say it. Of course, we're talking about those here competing for the Republican nomination. There are others, though, competing maybe for a nomination of another kind or to get into the race. We got some labels news today on two fronts. One being that Larry Hogan of Maryland, former governor, is no longer the chair of No Labels. The other being a few reports that No Labels is talking to Chris Christie now that he's out of the race. Caitlin, what do you make of both of those things? Do they fit together, or is it just a coincidence?
Concept, yeah.
Look, No Labels, their entire strategy is designed to block either Biden or Trump from getting 270 electoral votes, which would send the election to the House of Representatives and guarantee chaos like we've never seen before. Chris Christie has been very clear that he believes the No Labels unity ticket is a fool's errand. And, it reminded me earlier today of that scene in Dumb and Dumber where they're like, so you're saying there's a chance. And, the thing with Larry Hogan, it's hard to know what he's up to. He's obviously he was very involved in the effort. I think you have to wonder if he's leaving because they're not going to give him the ticket or if he's going to run. But what it says to me is they have no plan. They don't know what they're doing, and they're really playing with live ammo when it comes to our democracy. And I think if they can't show us a path to victory for which there is none, they should really stop their effort.
Well, there's a lot there. Could Chris Christie move the needle in the third party if he couldn't as a Republican?
Last night, I think he did the best thing for the GOP by stepping back for New Hampshire. There's an avenue where Nikki Haley could topple Donald Trump in that primary. And so he did the best thing for the party, but also to his end goal, which was to make sure Donald Trump wasn't the nominee. And so I don't see that he would do that and then go ahead and run as a third party. I don't see him doing that, and nor should he. I think he did what he needed to do. He spoke out against Trump. He also pointed out, ambition is not, how you should govern to make your decisions. I thought that was really helpful to say out loud. People needed to hear that.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I think, it's not a viable option for him.
We thank you for the insights and a great conversation with Maura Gillespie and Caitlin Legacki. We thank you as we return to breaking news that has popped up since we've taken air less than an hour ago. And it's coming from the UK, where Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has authorized joint military strikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen. This is according to sources speaking with Bloomberg earlier, Kayleigh, this would be a big deal. We're talking about joint military strikes that would presumably include the U.S. We've not heard from the White House on this.
According to the source that spoke with Bloomberg, the U.S. is included in this, and it could happen, these airstrikes, as early as this evening. So, of course, we here at Bloomberg will keep you all apprised.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted here. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. In the meantime, we'll meet you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg.